Welcome back to Autism Spectrum Resources for Marriage and Family. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie C. Holmes, and I have with me my guest today, Sarah Casburn. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thanks, Stephanie. So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let me tell y'all a little bit about Sarah. She is a late diagnosed autistic woman and autistic mom who combines her 20 years of personal and professional experience in a variety of areas that include early childhood education, autism and behavioral science, sensory enrichment, nutrition, children's ministry to support families and volunteers in a fresh approach. She is the founder of Crown Family Wellness, Neuroscience, and Nutrition for Neurodiversity, which supports children and adults as well as a ministry stream dedicated to support church communities all across Canada and the USA. And we have so much to talk about because Sarah is a wealth of information. And I wanted to start with you, Sarah, a little bit about your career in autism before you were diagnosed, because you started in ABA. So will you tell us a little bit about that? Because ABA is kind of controversial right now.
It sure is, and I'll tell you, I didn't know that when I got into it. It was way back in the day. I had always known that I wanted to work in some capacity with children with challenges. So I started out in about 2004 by studying early childhood education, just knowing that was the first step. And when I was in school, a new postgrad program was launched for autism behavioral science. So I was able to go directly into that from graduation. And it kind of seemed like the perfect fit since I'd always been intrigued with autism, but I didn't exactly know how to get into the field. So it kind of presented itself on a silver platter from the Lord. And so I ended up working as an instructor therapist, which they now call an RBT, so registered behavior technician. And that was for a children's hospital in their clinical program called IBI, so intense behavioral intervention, which uses ABA therapy, so applied behavior analysis, lots of acronyms there. And I know that there are opinions both ways, and I can see both perspectives. And I will say that I like that ABA is a framework of principles that, supports skill building, breaking larger tasks into smaller ones, improving communication, assessing the functions of behavior, which is super important, and, promoting development so someone can reach independence. I think for me, the struggle was kind of threefold. So I found it personally challenging myself to navigate, 3 hour long therapy sessions that really volleyed between, protecting a child from their self-injurious behavior, protecting me from their physical harm, and still somehow find a way to teach and test skills, often with non-speaking children in really small clinic rooms without me having a break. And that was twice a day, every single day. Secondly, I knew that the sessions were super hard work for the kids. And that's probably why at times their behaviors were higher. And it made me feel really bad that I was stressing them out, even though I was trying to help them. And thirdly, it sort of seemed to take a really long time for a lot of the kids to see really significant progress. So it kind of felt like a lot of work for a little bit of a reward at times. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work. There were absolutely some children who thrived in that environment. I'm just saying that I recognize that it was tough on both sides for many cases. Although I did see that home-based sessions, seemed less stressful for the kids.
So, some of the arguments out there, some adults on the spectrum who they were diagnosed as children, but now as adults would say it felt like dog training. It felt like you're just trying to neurotypicalize me. It felt like you're just trying to, conform me into the neurotypical approach so that I would behave and listen to people in authority. And so some would take this really extreme approach of just let us be and let us do whatever we want. And, no therapies at all, no speech, no OT, no PT, no ABA, nothing, just, kind of leave us be, which I definitely don't believe that is a good approach. We know that interventions and early diagnosis and early interventions can be very helpful. So specifically then just kind of name the parts of the ABA program that concerned you and even kind of your own internal check system when you were doing some of these things. Again, you're not diagnosed yet in the timeline, but you were just having some concerns with some of the later, like maybe decade or so practices of ABA.
Yeah, so there were definitely times where I would observe, other therapists implementing ABA principles without the regard for the children's emotional capacity, for example. So if a child was crying while sitting at a table being taught or tested skills, the therapist might continue testing despite, the sobbing. which was so hard to see. And that isn't the standard process. The standard process is that if a child displays, I'm going to say, quote, escape behavior, that the therapist is to have the child follow through with the last demand or ask in, a modified way so that they're more able to perform it. But in order to prevent them from increasing their, again, escape behaviors going forward. But I know for me that when I've been kind of forced to do something that upsets me or I no longer have margin for whatever reason, it has been emotionally harmful for me and at times traumatizing. So I really encourage therapists or caregivers for that matter to be really sensitive to someone's cues. Rarely does a child or an adult for that matter go from content rather to melting down in an instant, right? There's always going to be some type of ramp up. So they could be physical, like maybe they say break in whatever capacity they're able to communicate, or maybe they're physical signs like crying, or they throw things, or they're even getting up from the table or whatever they're doing. Even if something that they're, quote, working for is, their top reinforcing or preferred activity. I really believe that it's our ethical responsibility to be really proactive in monitoring cues to prevent these escalations and harm, which may or may not be happening in session because, not all sessions are recorded or observed. And it really depends on the individual staff in their sessions, how they go about following through with these programs.
Yeah, I remember I personally didn't have ABA for my daughter Sydney, but when she was in a BEH or behavior focused classroom, the teacher had that style. And the thing that would really frustrate me, and we eventually pulled her from the school, is the teacher would upset Sydney on purpose to get her to escalate so that she could, quote, teach her, how to calm down. And I was like, with everything that's going to happen in a school day, she's going to get frustrated or escalated on her own. Do you really have to get her upstated? Because in my mind, I'm thinking, even as a neurotypical person, if you came and did that to me and upset me on purpose, I'm not going to trust you. I'm not going to like you. It's almost like a weird sort of grooming. Like you're going to upset me to get me to calm down, to try to get me to build a relationship with you. Like I wouldn't like that.
And I would say
And
that's a
so
deviation. That's a deviation from what the intention is. To my knowledge and my professional training, both in school and on site, that would not have been recommended. So again, that's that sort of outside the norm, the freedom that unfortunately we have as therapists to be able to. I sometimes liken it to the Bible. Like if you can have the same set of ideas and theologies, but we can implement those a million different ways, right? And that's why recorded observations are important, and those things are typically observed on a regular basis, but there's always going to be the exception to the rule because it's human nature, right?
So you started out your kind of career before your own diagnosis.
Yeah.
You probably implemented things when your kids, because both of your kids are diagnosed. So now, with your own diagnosis and looking back, are you kind of overall for it, against it, or just for specific parts of it?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to sort of be like neutral on this because I do believe that for some families, ABA can absolutely be the right choice if the program goals are appropriate for the individual rather than just maybe arbitrarily society's definition, because different isn't necessarily bad, as long as we're still moving towards supporting independence and accounting for an individual's autonomy and interests and reasonable limits. I think again that's generally the intention, but with anything in life there's going to be um, those variations that are going to contribute to the narrative of harm. I also believe that for other families, ABA may not be the right fit, which can be hard because it's the gold standard, right? And so you may or may not be able to determine if it's right for you before you try it. Maybe you absolutely know it's not right for you, and I totally respect that. But maybe you are like us, where you try it and you find that it's not necessarily the right choice. And so I think it's important for families to feel comfortable with your provider and have really excellent open communication, what's happening in sessions, how things are or are not progressing. Just to have that continual sense if it's on the right path, and even more so if you can sort of have an understanding of how the therapists work and Home-based is also really helpful. So you can kind of also keep an ear out right within your environment. And I would also really, really like to see that the medical community consider other approaches to be recommended, possibly even supported financially, such as nutritional deficiencies, dietary intake, gut health, and other paths that do have evidentiary support, but are not necessarily being communicated to families or promoted as, credible options.
Yeah, and you keep saying the gold standard. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in the United States, insurance, one of the few kind of autism protocols or therapies that is recommended and will get approved is ABA. And so a family gets a new diagnosis, like, what do we do? What do we do? Oh, ABA, because that's what's covered by our insurance. Because a lot of the stuff, when we move into neuroscience and nutrition in a little bit, sometimes that stuff isn't covered by insurance or so I don't know, is ABA kind of the quote gold standard in Canada? I know y'all's system works a little bit different, but is that one of the main protocols that is supported?
It definitely is the primary care path that is sort of recommended from physicians or diagnosing practitioners. And I think that our systems in Canada, especially in Ontario, where I'm from, we've been in transition for a really long time, and it's been very difficult. And so there are even people who, regardless if you live in Ontario, you've been waiting years even just to access services. So I think it's painful sometimes for me as a mom to know that there are people who are waiting 5, 6 years to get funding or services just to find out it's not the right path, right? And then we've kind of missed those critical periods of development.
So frustrating. Well, so let's kind of go back to because the history is your kids were diagnosed before you and your husband. So did you go that route of ABA with your daughters? If so, what did that look like? Did it work? What didn't work?
So, believe it or not, we actually did, because as soon as we found out that it was autism, I took that as a message from God that, the reason I had become an autism therapist, as it says in the book of Esther, for a time such as this, right? That this is exactly why I was here and had been trained. So, unfortunately, I didn't actually stop to ask God what direction to go. And so I kind of got exactly what my own strength could get me. And it wasn't very fruitful and super confusing and really devastating, right? So, at the time that our youngest was diagnosed, our child psychologist had directly advised me against being involved in her ABA program because he knew I had been in the field and how burned out I already was. We had been in crisis for years at that point due to her severe emotional dysregulation, daily aggression towards like our pets and myself and her older sister. She was eloping, so running away. We couldn't go anywhere in public or family events without significant meltdowns or safety concerns and eating issues and sleep and all the list goes on. And so the diagnosis, again, like you said, made us eligible for funding that would cover the cost of ABA, which was in our area, thousands and thousands of dollars a month. So we felt that it was worth a shot because we had already, by that time, tried many, many other things that didn't work. I had hired a local ABA company, worked with a BCBA, so that's a board certified behavior analyst, to oversee the programs that I designed that I felt were important for my daughter, which typically a mom wouldn't do. But again, because I was in the field, I had that training. Uh, she oversaw, my implementation of it and my data collection. And very quickly, I could see it wasn't working. And I was even more burned out as predicted. So we switched things up to have one of their staff come and take over for me in home based. And we kind of gave it the, good old college try for about 8 months when we can see it just was not working regardless of the change. And I could tell that my daughter was kind of getting frustrated and needed a break, even though she really loved the lady who was coming, Janet. It was sad for her to have her not come into the house anymore, but we just knew that it was kind of that time. And we didn't have anything left at that point that we were aware of that we could have done to help. Thankfully, though, God had a plan, and he really dropped an answer in our lap. It's kind of one of those pray for years situations, and he kind of swoops in at the 11th hour and reveals an answer, which we're going to talk about.
Okay, so you done your work. This is your field. This is the gold standard. We're going to try it with our family. It's not working for your daughter. You, everybody in the family's diagnosed now. So, what's kind of a three-prong approach, or what tools did work? What is working for your family? Will you tell us about those?
For sure. So now, so Crown Family Wellness is my practice, and the tagline I have is neuroscience and nutrition for neurodiversity. And so nutrition includes nutraceuticals, which is a fancy way of saying supplements. I work directly with caregivers and individuals with programs that I'm now trained in because they worked so well for our family. The first tool that helped us was sensory enrichment therapy. And then after that, we partnered with a doctor who specialized in autism, who helped us nutritionally with a biomedical diet. And then after that, we started using nutraceuticals that really targeted gut health and methylation and detoxification pathways.
So you mentioned sensory enrichment therapy, and I don't think that's as well known, right? You list all these protocols, and it's ABA, OT, PT, maybe HIPAA therapy. Oh, I forgot hyperbaric chamber, chelation. Like there's all these things that kind of come out. So, what is sensory enrichment therapy? Tell us a little bit about that, and why is it helpful?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? So I hadn't heard of it either. And I have been in and out of the field for 15 years. So I kind of had my doubts initially, and it kind of had some pretty impressive, what I call wild promises. But honestly, it's a shame that it's not more well known because it's incredible. And I kind of want to nominate it to be the new gold standard. I'm not really in charge of that. So I just do my best to spread the word. So sensory enrichment therapy, often when someone hears the name at that first glance, they kind of confuse it with the use of fidgets, maybe an overall increase of what's called a sensory diet. And sometimes people even think sensory integration therapy. And those approaches can be helpful for some people, absolutely, but it generally doesn't result in the type of boost in brain development that sensory enrichment actually provides. It is evidence-based, it's clinically validated as a neuroscience, and it essentially taps into the brain's really incredible ability at any age to be neuroplastic. You've probably heard of neuroplasticity. And so that essentially means being able to reorganize the structure of the brain, grow or develop further where there might be deficits in development or trauma or injury. So basically, it's in short is a method of growing and repairing the brain or rewiring those connections. And we're not talking just beneficial for autism or ADHD or just neurodiversity. This can help addiction, abuse, trauma, grief, divorce, postpartum, caregiver burnout, and siblings of children with challenges, and that can be super hard to find support in, at least in Canada. Down syndrome, fetal alcohol, seizures, Tourette's, and even seniors with cognitive decline and dementia. So that's phenomenal to see the range of application. And the main areas that it improves are mood. So that includes anxiety and depression, behavior, communication, sleep, eating, memory, self-awareness, sensory processing, learning, social skills, attention, and motor skills.
A
So
lot.
that's a lot. That's a lot, right?
That's a lot of things.
I mean, basically everything that the brain does, right? So we've kind of categorized them in that fashion. And so it was first developed 30 years ago in France, and it was based on the research from environmental enrichment. And then it came to America for hospitals, daycares, schools, and now it is just widely internationally used among children and adults, and even for relationships, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And as you mentioned earlier, I've even adapted, with permission, the program to support children's ministries across Canada and the US, and so in a faith-based context as well. And there have been 2 randomized control trials done, which is great because then we can see the success of a duplication study, which is super important. And it was also awarded the best neuroscience paper in the Journal of the American Psychological Association.
So, how does it work? And I have to tell you, Sarah, sometimes it's really hard when I'm so with kids, right? We've got a little bit as parents and guardians and adults to be like, hey, we're going to do these things. And then we know that there's this huge demographic of people, the lost generation of autism, that are adults, 40 and older. It's really hard to get them to do some things like this. So talk about how does this work, and how would it also benefit adults?
That's a good question too. It's basically the mechanism pairs two senses at the same time. So let's say smell and touch, and that's going to stimulate the brain in specific targeted areas that have shown readiness. And again, that's as an adult or a child. And these are areas that are determined by online brain assessments that really meet a customized goal for an individual. And it uses simple household items. You're not having to go out and buy fancy equipment. I know that can be the case for a lot of other therapies. And again, it's suitable for all ages. The program is really unique in that it's directly provided by a caregiver or a partner or a household member. And again, it's using an online program, and it's going to provide you with worksheets of 3 to 5 daily brain exercises. And the system's going to check in on you for your progress of the brain every 2 weeks. And then it's going to switch some exercises out based on the changes that we're detecting. And this is important because that neuroplasticity we talked about is going to feed off of novelty, and it also helps you not get bored. And so rather than taking up one or many hours of the day, like we know ABA or other therapies can, it's super efficient, and it only needs 5 to 10 minutes a day to grow and retain those new brain connections. And, we were fully supported with a certified therapist who connected with us regularly to check in and provide adaptations and modifications to the program where it's needed. So it's really tailored to that person, because we know not everything's going to go quite as smoothly as we see it on, on a demonstration video, right?
I've heard you say that, it can be 5 to maybe 10 minutes a day, but then how long should you be doing the program for to really see changes? Because you mentioned neuroplasticity, which I love, and anybody who is listening to the show know I love Wilder and know I love talking about building kind of new connections within the brain. So how long does, sometimes someone does something for a week or 2 weeks, it's like, it's not working, this isn't doing it for me, this is weird, this feels silly. Because you and I have talked about one of the protocols is like rubbing an orange, on your body, to feel the orange and smell the orange and see the orange is like, that's weird. I'm not doing that. That's for kids. So really, how long should someone be doing this program to see some kind of results?
That's kind of a twofold answer. I would say, first of all, don't do what we did. We had so much progress in the first 2 months of the program that we're like, hey, we're happy with where we are. Let's just call it a day and just be done and just live our lives now. And we actually saw more progress for our daughter in only the first 2 weeks, and I thought we were going to have the whole 6 months it's recommended as a minimum. And I actually, with clients, I've seen some changes in the first 24 hours. But by dropping the program early, we did start to see regression of some of the challenges. So we did have to go back to it. And that's, thankfully not a full regression, because, some of those brain connections that we nurtured over those 2 months were mature enough to stay. But some of the ones that were newer, that were not yet mature, weren't given that stimulation and time needed, so they didn't last. And they were basically pruned. So that's why the program is generally recommended for a period of six to 12 months, depending, but there's never a contract. You're always on a month to month, so you can decide if you want to continue, if it's still working, all that jazz. So I've even known of one family who did it for 2 years just because they found it that enjoyable. It was part of the routines. They could afford it, and they were seeing continued progress. And, I can really appreciate that, because especially as children shift across those developmental seasons in the early years, depending on where they're starting from, if they have significant catching up to do developmentally, that makes sense. They may want to do it for longer. There is no harm in doing it long term. Again, as long as you're seeing improvements, you're still enjoying it, part of your routines, and it's financially viable, absolutely, you can continue.
So you mentioned seeing these improvements and things changing in 24 hours or 2 weeks. What are some observable, measurable changes that you would observe?
So for our family, what I call the biggest wow moments is we had for our youngest daughter. She was the one that had severe aggression, was running away. By the time 2 weeks had passed of the program, and that's really just using the first get your brain ready for the program type of worksheet, we couldn't remember the last time that she had a meltdown. We realized that the tantrums had stopped, and she was just overall more emotionally regulated, which I now know is very common as one of the first things to see progress with. There were other benefits like eating. One day I asked her what she wanted for lunch, rather than that usual fight of, me trying to get her to eat something. And she just turned to me and said, whatever you want me to have, mama. And I'm telling you, my mind sucks. We're completely blown because I actually never thought that she would be that open to food. My oldest daughter had better emotional regulation. She stopped fighting self-care like showers. Now she takes her own initiative and we never have to ask her, and we can't get her out of there. And I have the water bill to prove it. Her ability to now express her thoughts and emotions have really flourished. Before we could barely get her to say two words about, how was camp or how did you do at your friend's house? There was just a lot of I don't knows. And now every day, not only do we get the playback, of every single little detail, almost too much. Where we're like, okay, let's wrap this up, which is a super good problem to have. I'm not complaining, but it just goes to show you the difference. I've noticed that both the girls are much more tolerant of sounds and physical touch. Our oldest daughter really was sort of touch aversive. And, now she'll just come and sit right beside me, shoulders touching and, reading a book, or, we'll search funny cat videos together. So that has really shifted. And honestly, just more importantly, it's really taken us out of crisis, which we had been in for years.
Now, what about as a couple? So you and your spouse are both neurodivergent. So did you do these things as a couple, and did you see any results in your marital relationship or how you relate to each other?
So this is where I had more to say, but I'm going to tell you the little bit that I do have to say. My husband did try it out on me for a few days around the time that we started the program and saw the changes for our kids, just to see what would happen. And I had been diagnosed with lots of things, story for another time, but one of them was complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was shocked that my typical, startle response and like immediate anger where I'm, ready to sort of fight for my life. It didn't happen the very next day that he did the first protocol. And I'm not saying that that's a typical period of progress, but it really just goes to show how incredibly supportive that it is for our nervous system, because I've had that trauma response for decades. Unfortunately, at the time that we were, working our way through, again, long-term crisis, that neither of us really had the margin to do the program for each other on top of the kids and all the things that come with that. But I am committed this year to focusing on that, because I've worked with other adults, both neurotypical and neurodiverse, and I have seen the results. So I know for a fact that it can and will help us. Um, and just overall for the family, there really were so many wow moments and fantastic progress. I'd probably be here for hours recapping them if I could. But at the end of the day, I ended up learning that my professional credentials allowed me to become certified in this neurotherapy after we had done the program for our family. So I've been working as a provider since 2021, direct with other families, which is really great, because then I have the bonus side of both lived experience, so I can relate with caregivers so much more than when I was just an ABA therapist.
I want to go back and highlight something that you said, because some people might be hearing this and say, yeah, well, Sarah, you're neurodivergent. So, maybe that's why you feel like it works for you. But you said also what could be helpful is even for neurotypicals, especially if there's complex PTSD or some kind of anxiety disorder, or, like I'm neurotypical, but I have sensory issues myself. So I think you mentioned that. I was going to go back and highlight that you feel like even if it's you and your husband are both neurodivergent, but a neurodivergent and a neurotypical spouse could benefit from doing these exercises together. So I thought that was important to say.